Let's read chapter 5 in the book Someone Was Watching. Pat decided to come over early. Real early. 5 minutes after their phone conversation, Chris looked out his upstairs bedroom window and saw him run into the front yard. He was doing his impersonation of a running back, dodging and faking and hurdling phantom defenders as he crossed the lawn. One hand cradled an imaginary football while the other warded off would-be tacklers. Chris smiled but didn't laugh. At nearly 6 feet and 170 pounds, with sprinter's speed, Pat looked as if he belonged on a football field, and he did. Like Chris, he played junior football since he was 8 years old. Chris hurried downstairs, listening for the doorbell, half expecting Pat to crash right in. But he didn't hear anything, and when he opened the door, he saw why. Pat was doing his touchdown dance on the lawn, his back to the house. Chris let him go through his whole routine, including the ceremonial spiking of the imaginary ball, before letting him know he had a real audience. "Nice moves, hot dog," Chris said. "They never laid a hand on you, but the ref just dropped his penalty flag." Pat turned slowly, a sheepish grin on his face. "You'd better be practicing your dance too, Chris," he said. "You know you're going to be getting some TDs this year." "If we have anyone to throw me the ball," Chris said. His team wasn't known for its passing attack. "Hey, if we don't have anyone else that can do it, I'll get back there and toss you a few." "I won't hold my breath," Chris said. "But Pat probably could probably do it, and the coaches would probably let him." "You coming in?" Chris said. "Yeah," Pat said, walking toward the door. He gave Chris a playful punch to the shoulder, a playful punch that Chris felt all the way down to his bones. "How you doing, big guy?" Pat said. "How was your weekend?" "Better than I figured it would be," Chris said. He thought for a moment while they walked into the house, and he closed the door behind them. "A lot better than I figured it would be." "Really?" Pat said, looking Chris in the eye. "It really went okay?" "My mom and dad are talking again," Chris said quietly. He glanced around, not sure where they were, but they didn't appear to be in hearing range, at least. "They're even talking to each other." "That's great," Pat said. "That's great." He made a throwing motion and then repeated it. "You want to go out and toss the football around for a while?" "The real one?" "The real one. You can even practice your dance." "It's a deal," Chris said. Chris was nearly starving when they sat down to dinner, but by the time he was halfway through his spaghetti, Pat's plate was already empty. Pat, who had started out with a mountain of a serving, sat with his fork in his hand and had a silly look on his face, as if he were waiting for a load of pasta to fall from the sky. "I think the solution to America's food surplus needs another helping," Chris said. His mom, who had barely started on her food, looked over at Pat and his clean plate, smiled and shook her head. "Would you like some more, Pat?" she said. "I thought you'd never ask," he said, handing her his plate. "Why don't you just bring the whole pot over for him?" Chris's dad said. Chris and Pat did the dishes and stuffed into the dimly lit family room, where Chris's mom was removing the tape from the video camera. She handed it to his dad, who put it into the recorder. "You guys ready for this?" he said. They nodded and found chairs to sit in while Chris's dad started the tape and sat down on the couch with his mom. The television screen flickered on, and Chris focused in on it. Everything else in the room blurred and faded out. The TV was nothing but gray fuzz and buzzing for what seemed like a month. He wondered if the whole tape were blank, and whether or not he'd be disappointed if it were. He didn't think he would. Maybe something had been wrong with the camera that day. Maybe there was something else they could watch instead. Anything else. But then his mom's face came on the screen, and his dad's voice tumbled out of the speaker. "Tell us what day it is, hon." "It's May 20th, his mom said, "and we're on our way to the river for a weekend of fun and sun. Greenwater, here we come." The picture faded out and right back in again, and there was Molly, walking through the front door holding Chris's hand. As they approached the driveway, the camera zoomed in on her, showing her face in close-up, her blonde hair aglow in the morning sun. She was looking up at Chris with a serious expression on her face. Her voice floated out of the TV as if she were right in the room. "I want to sit in Daddy's seat, Kiss. I want to drive to the river." "When you're bigger, Molly," Chris's voice said. The picture faded out, and then she was back on the screen again, sitting in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel, smiling at the camera through the open window. "I'm driving the car," she said with a big smile. Where are you driving, Molly? His mom's voice said. I'm driving to the river, Molly said, far away to the big river, to our little house. In the next scene, she was in the back of the car with Chris, sitting in her car seat and looking grumpily through the back window. Her plans had been spoiled. But she smiled and waved at the camera when Chris asked her to. Then they were on the road. Pictures taken through the car window of the countryside between home and the river flashed on the screen. Road noise and music and voices paraded from the speaker. Chris picked Molly's small voice out of the jumble, trying to sing along with a song on the radio. He closed his eyes and imagined she was there in the room. Her voice stopped, and he opened his eyes again. Her face filled the screen. Chris had caught her sleeping in her seat, her head flopped to the side, her long eyelashes resting on her round cheeks. Then she was gone again. They arrived in Greenwater, and his dad was operating the camera, doing his traditional scene of Chris's mom walking out of the women's room at the gas station. On every trip they took, he had to have at least one of these shots. He called it his contribution to art. Chris's mom called it childish. Once she even crawled out of a restroom window to escape the camera, but she usually managed to laugh with the rest of the family when the segment showed up on the TV screen. Now she was walking out once more, this time holding Molly's hand. Molly could never decide to go the first time she had a chance to. She was looking up at her mom and talking while they walked toward the camera. Now can we get ice cream, Mom? She asked. Now can we? The next scenes ran together like a steady stream of cold rain drops on Chris's head. Mom and Chris walking into the clover bed for ice cream and wandering back out with Bud and Clover and an ice cream cone the size of a small building in Molly's hand. More scenery between town and the summer house, and scenes at the house. Chris and his dad throwing the football in the front yard, his mom pointing out the famous tree, the tree with a 6-inch trunk that Chris tried to hide behind once to avoid taking some medicine. Molly helping to mow the lawn with her toy lawnmower. Then they were at the beach. Molly in her little flowery swimsuit trying to catch a big plastic ball. Molly and Chris racing each other through the sand. Molly winning and squealing with delight and running ankle deep through the cold water. Molly and Chris and their dad eating lunch on the blanket. Molly feeding leftover bread to a squirrel. The river scenes started, the ones Chris taped after he wandered down to the beach by himself. He knew he'd seen the last of Molly, but he kept watching the screen, transfixed by the motion and color and dim noises in the background. A bird, a water skier, a splash far out in the river. Sand and grass and trees and sunshine. A quiet day in the late spring. Then the screen was blank, and the only sound from the speaker was the buzz of dead static. Chris kept staring at the fuzzy gray image in front of him, vaguely aware of Pat getting up and moving toward the door. I gotta go, big guy, Pat whispered. Talk to you tomorrow. And he was gone. Too late. Chris waved his hand and said, See ya, Pat. The effort dragged him out of his trance. He glanced around the room. His mom and dad, sound asleep, leaned on each other in the middle of the sofa. He stood, stretched, and walked stiffly over to them. He gently shook his dad's shoulder, but got no response. Dad? Mom? He said in a tired voice, but they didn't move. He pulled a big knit blanket from underneath the coffee table, draped it carefully over them, and started upstairs, switching off the TV and VCR on the way. Sometime during the night, he awoke with his mom and dad standing over his bed, dim light streaming through the open door from the hall. You okay, Chris? His dad asked. You were talking in your sleep, his mom said. For a minute, Chris couldn't think. I'm okay, he finally said, but he didn't feel okay. He felt troubled, burdened, but he didn't know why. Well, sleep tight then, his dad said and put his hand on Chris's head. His mom kissed his cheek, and they walked out and closed the door, leaving Chris sweating in the warm room. Then he remembered his dream, the warm wind in his face, the trees drifting like ship's sails, the exhaustion, the silence in the car. Then the voice on the radio, sounding just as it had during the trip back home from the summer place last May, the flat, uncaring voice trying to sound concerned. Missing and presumed drowned, it had said. Missing and presumed drowned. He got out of bed and staggered to the bathroom for a drink. He didn't feel better when he got back to his room. It wasn't just his dream he could forget. It was a memory that would play in his mind forever. And something else that was gnawing at him, too. But he couldn't figure out what it was. He sat on the edge of his bed and thought, but nothing shook loose. Whatever was stuck tight. Finally, he crawled back under the covers and fell asleep, tossing fitfully back and forth across the mattress. When he opened his eyes again, it was still dark. The only light in his room shone from his clock radio. He turned on his side to look at it. 3:21. Early. Real early. He didn't even get up that early to go fishing. But he was wide awake, and something was playing through his mind. Something troubling. The videotape. Scenes and sounds from the videotape were rolling through the built-in player in his head. But they were fuzzy, and he couldn't play them back. He couldn't reverse and fast forward and stop them in their tracks. He lay on his back and tried to think. Had he just been dreaming, or had a bit of reality crept into his dreams? He couldn't sort it out. He had to go downstairs and see. The family room was dark. Chris switched on a table lamp to low power, blinking his eyes to get used to the light, and turned on the TV and VCR. He picked up the remote control and sat down on the rug 6 feet in front of the screen. After rewinding the tape, he hit the play button, and the familiar images reappeared. Once again, his family was in the river, but this wasn't what he wanted to see. He hit the fast-forward button and stopped. Country scenes taken from the car window. Fast forward. Stop. His mom coming out of the restroom. Fast forward. Stop. He and Molly walking into the clover bud. Fast forward. Stop. At the summer house. Fast forward. Stop. At the beach. Fast forward. Stop. His shots down at the water. Stop. This was what he needed to see. He reversed the tape a bit to make sure he wouldn't miss anything, and then let it play. Molly was feeding the squirrels again, for just a moment, and then she was gone, and the camera lens was scanning slowly along the river's surface, following a lone duck landing in the water, and a water skier stopped at a splash for just an instant and continued on. The sandy shoreline and point of land to the south, with the river beyond it, and unseen, the dock, the turtles. The camera continued its sweep away from the beach to the grass. Then the trees floated into the picture. A squirrel darted into a clearing, and the camera stopped to study it, picking up something and stuffing it into its mouth. It sat on its hind legs and chewed, and the camera zoomed in on it. Behind the squirrel, the trees stood thick and leafy, but a few cars were visible in the parking lot beyond. On the road, an occasional car passed with a glint of sunshine and a whoosh. And now Chris could hear a new sound, barely audible at first, and then louder, but still faint, still distant. It was music, a familiar music box tune. He hadn't just dreamed it. The camera stayed on the squirrel. Chris's eyes were watering. His ears were straining. He was afraid to blink. This should be the place if his mind wasn't playing tricks on him. He waited, his mouth a dry sponge, as the music got louder and suddenly blended in with the sounds of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot from the highway. Then it appeared through the trees, big and white and dappled with shade. A ghost in the shadows. And now the music was even louder, more distinctive. The vehicle, half hidden by trees and bushes, inched across the screen and stopped, its black half still visible. For another heartbeat, Chris could hear the music, and then it stopped, replaced by the idle of a motor. As the squirrel chewed and the engine idled, Chris watched and listened. For what seemed like an eternity, he listened. Finally, he heard a muffled thud, the sound of a car door closing, and the vehicle eased out of the picture, the rumble of its motor growing louder and then softer as it accelerated out of the parking lot. He continued to listen until the squirrel disappeared from the screen and was replaced by blue skies and clouds. But the music didn't play again. Chris took a deep breath and thought for a moment, his heart racing. He hit the stop button, then reverse, then stop, and then back to play. On the screen, the squirrel was eating again, quietly enjoying its food. Chris waited, listening, edging closer to the TV. When he heard the first faint strains of the music, he started counting slowly. By the time the music stopped, he'd gotten to 27. He reversed the tape, started again, and waited. As the vehicle appeared on the screen, he hit the pause button. A still picture appeared. A picture of a squirrel and grass and trees and a large white van, frozen in the parking lot. The room was silent, as if Chris had put everything on pause, but he was conscious of his heartbeat as he slid even closer to the TV to get a better look. Now he could see it for sure, even out of focus and cut into sections and shaded by the trees. It was still visible. A big ice cream cone, golden yellow and chocolate brown and tilted to the right, was painted on the side of the truck. He couldn't make out the words underneath it, but he knew what they were. His heart beat faster. He could feel the pulses in his head. He hit the pause button again, leaning his head to listen, and the tape moved forward. The music resumed. The van slowed to a stop halfway out of the picture. The music stopped abruptly, and Chris started counting. He got to 74 this time, more than a minute, before the van pulled quietly out of the picture. The picture faded out and back in again, and several seconds of puffy white clouds in a bright blue sky filled the screen. Then it went blank. With a trembling finger, he hit the stop button and then reverse, and the tape zipped backwards through the VCR. If he was there to sell ice cream, why didn't he leave the music on? Chris thought. He always leaves his music on in the parking lot. And if he wasn't there to sell ice cream, why was he there? He counted to 5, stopped the tape, and pressed the play button. The squirrel appeared again, busily chewing on its fragment of food. Chris turned up the sound. The noises he'd heard earlier were magnified, but he couldn't hear anything new. He moved to within a foot of the speaker and closed his eyes, concentrating. The music started, got louder, and stopped, right in the middle of "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." He continued to listen, looking at the screen now, but he couldn't concentrate. The scenes changed and the screen went blank, but he sat still for a long time, staring straight ahead. What did it mean? Anything? Nothing? A feeling was growing in the pit of his stomach. He didn't know if it was good or bad, but he didn't want to let it go. Missing and presumed drowned was what the radio man had said. Chris's mouth was dry and sour. He went into the kitchen, got a can of soda from the refrigerator, took a long drink, and brought it back to the family room. The TV screen was still blank. He turned the sound down and squatted in front of it. His eyes burned from too much staring and not enough sleep. He reversed the tape, trying to think, to sort things out. He stopped it and hit the play button. Too far. His mom was just coming out of the ladies' room. Fast forward, stop. He and Molly going to the clover bud. He pressed the pause button. There it was. Parked just outside the little store, the big white van took up the whole lower right-hand corner of the screen. Chris could see the long, horn-shaped speaker on top and the painted-on ice cream cone on the side. Underneath it were the words, "The Clover Bud's Traveling Treat Truck." Farther underneath, in smaller letters, Chris could read, "Miles of Smiles." Little yellow smiley faces formed the dots over the eyes. For as long as Chris could remember, Clover and Bud had had the van along with their store. During the summer and on mid-late spring and early fall weekends, they took turns covering a long route to the homes and beaches and parks in the Greenwater area. They sold ice cream and other frozen desserts and candy from the back of the truck. The beach park was one of their regular stops. But Chris couldn't think of a time when they'd stopped at the parking lot without the music playing the whole time. How could they sell anything if nobody knew they were there? Maybe they could see that there weren't very many people at the beach that day, or maybe they didn't want anyone to know they were there. But why? What would that mean? Chris didn't want to let himself even think about it. He hit the pause button again, and he and Molly resumed their walk into the clover bud. The picture faded out and quickly back in, and they were coming out. Molly had her big ice cream cone in one hand. Clover was holding her other hand as they walked out together onto the sidewalk. Chris paused with Bud for a moment in the doorway talking. What was it they were talking about? Fishing, Chris remembered. A new lure Bud had tried out. He liked to talk fishing and sports with Chris. Chris left Bud standing in the doorway and followed Molly and Clover onto the street as they approached the car. Clover stopped and bent down to whisper something in Molly's ear. Molly smiled mischievously, nodded her head, and dashed for the car. The picture faded out. When it came back on, they were at the summer house. Chris stopped the tape and played the Clover Bud scenes back again. He tried to think. Had Molly said anything? He remembered asking her what Clover had told her. What had she answered? On the screen, Clover was whispering to her again. What was it she was saying? In desperation, he hit the single-frame advance button, and the scene slowed down to a crawl. Clover's fleshy jaw and lips barely moved. Molly's smile spread across her face like an ink blot. Chris slammed his hand into the rug in disgust. There was no way he could read Clover's lips, even at this speed. But he let the scene play on, hoping for something. Then he remembered. A secret. It's a secret, Molly had said. And he hadn't pursued it. He'd been more interested in their plans for the day than Molly's silly little girl secret. But so what? What if Clover had just said that she'd give her another big ice cream cone the next time she came to the store? Chris shook his head. He was no detective, and he knew he was still having a hard time accepting that Molly was dead. But what if this feeling he was having wasn't just the brainchild of an overactive imagination, or wishful thinking, or too much spaghetti for dinner? What if Bud and Clover had something to do with her disappearance? What if she were alive somewhere now? A warm glow and a cold chill were battling out someplace deep inside him. He was too tired to think about it, and he knew he couldn't tell anybody now. There was nothing to tell yet, and it was very late, or early. Pre-dawn light was beginning to filter into the room. He stopped the tape, ejected it, and carried it up to bed with him. Then, when he woke up, he'd need some proof that this hadn't been a dream.